The valley lay wrapped in a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. Mist clung to the slopes like breath held too long, weaving through crooked trees and worn stone cottages that had stood longer than anyone could remember. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and smoke from hearth fires, rising in slow curls into the gray dawn. It was a place that time had forgotten, where each day bled softly into the next, and the people lived between the rhythm of the seasons and the weight of their fears. The village was small, no more than 30 homes scattered around a cold, shallow stream. In the mornings, the sound of the water carried faintly through the valley, mingling with the lowing of cattle and the creak of wooden carts. Yet even those familiar sounds could not dispel the unease that had taken hold. Crops had failed for 2 summers in a row, and the earth had begun to turn stubborn, as if withholding its blessings. Children coughed through the night, and the old claimed they could feel storms brewing deep within their bones. At dusk, when the light began to fade and the forest grew darker than the sky, the villagers shuttered their windows and locked their doors. They whispered of strange lights that flickered among the trees, of whispers that rose with the wind, of shapes that moved when no one should have been there. In the tavern, where ale dulled the edge of worry, they spoke of a woman who lived at the edge of the woods, a woman who knew things she should not. The stories were always told the same way. She could speak to ravens, heal the sick, and summon rain with her voice. To some, she was a witch. To others, merely a lonely soul who had learned too much from the old ways. But in a place ruled by fear, the difference hardly mattered. The valley had its own laws, and belief was stronger than truth. When the church bell rang on Sundays, its tone carried through the valley like a warning. The priest preached of faith and purity, of sin and temptation, and though he never said her name, everyone knew who he meant when he spoke of the serpent who hides in plain sight. The villagers nodded solemnly, crossing themselves as if each gesture could ward off whatever lingered in the woods. Yet there was beauty here too, a fragile kind that only those who stayed long enough could see. The morning frost painted the meadows in silver, and the river glimmered like glass beneath the pale sun. When the wind passed through the trees, it sounded almost like a song. But beauty and fear often lived side by side in the valley, and one never appeared without the shadow of the other. On quiet nights, a single light could be seen at the edge of the forest. It flickered faintly, steady, deliberate, as though someone were awake long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. No one dared to go near. Some said she was performing her rituals, others swore she was speaking to spirits. Children were told that if they wandered too close, they would never find their way back. So they grew up learning which paths to take and which to avoid, which names to say aloud and which to whisper. The truth, of course, was simpler. But truth had little place here. The valley had learned to survive by its fears, and fear was easier to feed than understanding. Every rustle in the woods, every sudden illness, every dying animal became another story, another reason to stay afraid. The villagers did not mean to be cruel, they only wanted to explain what they could not control. In their hearts, they carried more dread than malice. Sometimes, the mist would roll down from the mountains and settle low across the ground, covering everything in a ghostly veil. On those mornings, the world seemed softer, less real. The people moved slower, speaking in hushed tones, as though afraid to wake something ancient that slept beneath the earth. The woman by the woods, unseen but always thought of, became part of that landscape, a figure both feared and depended upon, though few would admit it. The older folk remembered a time when she had been one of them, before her mother died and she moved to the forest's edge. She had been quiet even then, more comfortable with silence than chatter. She had a way of listening that made people uneasy, as if she heard more than they said. When she began to heal small wounds and fevers with her strange mixtures of leaves and roots, people were grateful, until they weren't. Gratitude fades quickly when the world grows harsh. Now, years later, she was a story told to keep children obedient. Finish your chores, or the witch will find you. Don't wander after dark, or she'll take your voice. But behind those warnings lingered something else, an unspoken understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not the danger they claimed. Some of the villagers left offerings by the stream near her home. A piece of bread, a sprig of herbs, a silver coin. They did not call it worship. They called it precaution. As the moon rose above the valley, the fog thickened, wrapping the cottages in its cold arms. Dogs barked and then fell silent. The forest seemed to lean closer, its branches heavy with secrets. Inside each home, candles burned low, their light trembling across rough wooden walls. It was in moments like these that the valley felt most alive, listening, waiting, holding its breath. And somewhere beyond the fields, in the darkness where the trees met the sky, a woman stirred. Her lamp glowed softly through the window, casting a warm circle of light onto the grass. She was not a monster, nor a saint. Just a woman with knowledge no one else dared to keep, a woman whose name had become a warning. The night folded around her, and though the world would never know it yet, everything was about to change. Her cottage stood where the forest began, half hidden behind a curtain of birch trees and wild rose bushes. The path leading to it was narrow and uneven, worn by years of quiet footsteps and the weight of baskets filled with herbs. Moss crept up the stones, and ivy clung to the walls as if trying to keep the small house from being swallowed by the woods. In the mornings, mist drifted between the branches, wrapping her home in a pale haze that caught the sunlight and made it shimmer like glass. To anyone passing by, it looked less like a dwelling and more like something the forest had grown itself. Inside, the air smelled of lavender, smoke, and old parchment. Dried herbs hung from the beams in bunches, sage, thyme, foxglove, and plants no villager could name. A small fire burned in the hearth, steady and unhurried, its warmth filling the single room. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars and bowls, each labeled in a script few could read. Some held powders or roots, others bits of crystal, feathers, and small bones. It was a room that spoke in whispers, a place where silence was not emptiness but language. The woman moved through this space as if she were part of it, her steps soundless on the wooden floor. Her hair was streaked with silver, though her face carried the softness of someone who had lived close to nature's rhythm rather than against it. Her eyes, calm, watchful, deep as still water, seemed to hold both patience and sorrow. When she worked, her hands were steady, graceful, deliberate. She would crush leaves with the flat of her knife, stir with a wooden spoon, or tie bundles of herbs with twine while humming a tune no one else remembered. Her name was spoken rarely, and when it was, it came wrapped in hesitation. Some called her the woman by the woods, others simply her. To her, names had long since lost their weight. She lived by rhythm instead of calendar, by the turn of the moon instead of the tolling of the church bell. When the sun rose, she gathered. When it fell, she prepared. Life here had no beginning or end, only cycles, endlessly repeating, each one teaching her something new about the balance between growth and decay. Animals came to her door more often than people. A stray cat that refused to leave. A raven that perched by the window every morning, waiting for the scraps she left out. Sometimes, a wounded fox or bird would find its way to her, as though guided by instinct. She never turned them away. Her kindness was quiet, unnoticed, and unthanked, but it was steady. The forest seemed to understand her in a way the village never had. Every so often, she would walk down to the stream that divided her world from theirs. She carried a woven basket filled with glass vials and linen cloths, kneeling by the water to wash them. The sunlight danced across the ripples, turning everything gold for a moment before the shadows closed in again. From that spot, she could see the rooftops of the village in the distance, thin trails of smoke curling into the sky. She watched them with a kind of gentle detachment, neither bitter nor longing, simply accepting the distance that existed. It was safer that way, for them and for her. She had once tried to belong. Years ago, she had gone to the market in town, her hands full of tinctures and remedies meant to ease pain or fever. The first few who bought from her returned quietly, their sickness cured, their wounds mended. But gratitude had a short life in a fearful place. When one man's child fell ill again months later, he blamed her potions, not the sickness that had spread through the cold. Whispers began. Some said her medicines worked too well to be natural. Others claimed she spoke to the wind when she thought no one was listening. Eventually, she stopped going to the market altogether. In solitude, she found peace. She rose before dawn, listening to the forest wake, the slow unfolding of leaves, the distant call of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through undergrowth. Each sound reminded her that she was part of something vast and indifferent, yet beautiful. She tended her garden with reverence, knowing which herbs healed, which soothed, which could kill if used wrongly. Knowledge, she had learned, was a double-edged thing. It could save or destroy, depending on who held it. There were moments, rare but real, when the loneliness pressed against her like cold water. She would sit by the fire, hands folded around a cup of tea, and think of the faces she had known, the ones that turned away, the ones that forgot her. Sometimes, she imagined her mother's voice again, teaching her how to read the signs of the sky, how to listen to what the earth was saying. "They will fear you because they do not understand," her mother had once said. But remember, understanding isn't something you're owed. It's something you wait for. When storms came, she stood at her window and watched the lightning strike the ridge above the valley. The thunder echoed off the cliffs, shaking loose the old ghosts that lived in memory. And when the rain fell, she opened her door and let it in. She never prayed, not in the way the villagers did, but she did speak softly to the rain, thanking it for cleansing what words could not. The forest answered in its own quiet ways. The gentle drop of water from leaf to leaf, the sudden bloom of mushrooms after a downpour, the return of color to the moss along her steps. Children sometimes dared each other to come near her home. They never crossed the boundary of the last tree, but she saw them sometimes, faces peeking from behind trunks, eyes wide with the thrill of fear. She never scolded them. Instead, she would leave small tokens where she knew they might find them. A carved wooden bird, a polished stone, a sprig of mint. Little by little, those gifts turned the children's fear into wonder, though their parents would never let them admit it. At night, the woman would light a candle and write in a journal bound in worn leather. Her handwriting flowed like the movement of water, smooth, deliberate, ageless. The pages were filled with observations, the flowering of plants, the changes in the wind, the behavior of animals. She wrote not to be remembered, but to remember, to keep the thread of meaning unbroken between past and present. If anyone had watched her closely, they would have seen something extraordinary in her stillness, not sadness, but peace hard-earned, shaped by solitude and silence. Her world was one of patterns and patience, of small things that others overlooked. Yet beneath that calm surface lived a quiet strength, the kind that could endure misunderstanding without growing bitter. She did not know it yet, but that strength would soon be tested beyond anything she had ever known. It began with the cattle. One morning, a farmer found two of his healthiest cows lying still beside the stream, their eyes open, their bodies cold. By dusk, another farmer found the same. Within a week, the smell of decay hung over the valley, carried by a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The villagers whispered that it was a curse, that the air itself had turned against them. They spoke of foul omens, of the forest watching, of something stirring in the shadows that should have been left alone. Then came the sickness. It moved quietly at first, like fog slipping beneath doors. A child fell ill with fever, a mother coughed until she could no longer speak. The healer they once had, a man from a neighboring town, had died months ago, and no one had dared ask the woman by the woods for help. They remembered the warnings too well, the priest's voice echoing through the church about temptation, about the dangers of unholy remedies. So they prayed instead and waited. But prayer brought no rain, no health, no peace. Only fear that deepened with every passing day. Each night, as the mist thickened and the fires burned low, the talk turned darker. Men gathered outside the tavern, their faces drawn and hollow. Their voices dropped to low murmurs, then rose to anger. "This didn't start until she came down to the stream," one said. "I saw her washing bottles there." "She poisons the water," another replied. "I've heard she keeps the bones of animals in her house." It didn't matter that no one had seen such things themselves. In fear, stories multiply like shadows, growing longer until they touch every corner. Even those who had once defended her fell silent. A woman who had once been cured of fever by one of the herbal mixtures avoided her eyes when they crossed paths in the woods. A man who had bought salves for his wife's burns now crossed himself when her name was mentioned. The shift was subtle at first, but soon it became absolute. Every whisper was a thread, and together they wove a noose. The priest noticed the unrest and did nothing to stop it. On the contrary, his sermons grew sharper. He spoke of purity and sin, of evil disguised as goodness. He reminded the villagers of Eve's temptation, of women who listened to the serpent and brought ruin upon men. His words settled into their hearts like stones in water, heavy, sinking, impossible to remove. When the bell rang on Sunday morning, its echo no longer sounded like a call to prayer but like a warning. The woman by the woods sensed the change long before anyone came to her door. The forest grew quieter, even the birds seemed to avoid the paths near the village. When she went to gather herbs, she found footprints in places where none had been before, circling her home, stopping just beyond the window. She told herself it was nothing, that fear had made her too cautious. But fear has a scent, and it had begun to seep through the air like damp earth. One evening, a small group of men came to her door. Their leader, a farmer she had once helped, spoke for the rest. He said the sickness was spreading, that something had angered the Lord, and that people were beginning to think she knew why. His tone was measured, but his eyes never met hers. When she asked if they wanted her help, the men stepped back as if she had struck them. "No," he said quickly. "Just keep away from the village." Then they left, their torches throwing long, trembling shadows along the path. She watched them disappear into the fog and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. That night, she burned sage and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her, not to ward off spirits, but to steady her heart. She had known isolation but not hostility. To be feared was one thing, to be hated was another. The silence outside her window felt heavier than usual, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Days passed, and the illness worsened. The wells tasted of metal, the crops turned gray at the edges, and even the river began to run sluggish and dark. The villagers saw it as proof of what they already believed. Her magic had tainted the land. A child's death became her crime. A dying field became her curse. They found patterns where there were none, meaning in coincidence, purpose in misfortune. It was easier to blame a face than to accept the indifference of nature. Fear changed the way they spoke to each other. Husbands accused wives of harboring secrets. Neighbors turned away from neighbors. Doors that had always been left open were now bolted shut. In the market, talk of crops gave way to talk of punishment. Someone claimed to have seen her collecting nightshade, a poisonous plant. Another said she had been heard speaking to the dead. No one questioned the logic. In a place ruled by dread, stories became truth the moment they were spoken. The children were the first to act on what they'd heard. They threw stones at the edge of the forest, shouting curses they didn't understand. When one stone hit her window and cracked the glass, she didn't retaliate. She simply stood there, staring at the empty space between her house and the trees, knowing that the gap between her world and theirs had become unbridgeable. At night, she dreamed of fire, of orange light devouring her home, of faces twisted in rage. She woke with her pulse steady but her breath shallow. Somewhere deep down, she understood that dreams were sometimes warnings. The air outside carried a tension that made even the leaves whisper differently. Something was coming. Something that could no longer be stopped by silence. She tried, one last time, to make peace. She left small bundles of herbs by the church door, remedies that might ease fever or calm a cough. But in the morning, she found them trampled and scattered across the dirt. That was when she stopped trying. She gathered her things, her journals, her dried herbs, her mother's talisman, and placed them neatly on a shelf, as if preparing for a journey she did not wish to take. When the first shouts echoed through the valley that night, she did not move at once. She sat by the fire, listening to the voices growing louder, the rhythm of boots against earth. It was not the sound of justice or reason. It was the sound of fear made flesh. She stood slowly, her hand brushing the small charm at her neck, and whispered to the shadows, "So it begins." Outside, the torches burned brighter than the stars. The night was heavy with wind. It howled through the valley like an old voice crying warnings no one wanted to hear. Clouds hung low, pressing against the mountains, and the moon glowed weakly through their shifting shapes. In the distance, faint pinpricks of orange light began to move, torches, carried by hands trembling not with cold but with fear. Their glow rippled across the fields, each one joining the next until the whole valley seemed to flicker with restless fire. Inside her cottage, the woman sat still. Her small lamp burned low, its flame thin but steady. She had heard them before she saw the lights: angry footsteps, rough laughter, a child's frightened wail quickly silenced. She did not rise to meet them. There was nothing left to say that words could fix. Instead, she placed her mother's talisman upon the table and looked around the room one last time. Every jar, every dried plant, every page of her notebooks carried a fragment of her life, years of patience, of learning, of quiet kindness misunderstood. The air inside the house was thick with the scent of rosemary and ash. The first blow struck her door with the sound of splintering wood. Then another. Then a voice shouted, "Come out," which, followed by another rougher, "Burn her out if she won't." She could hear the fear in them, men desperate to destroy what they didn't understand. She rose slowly, her hands calm even as the door shook in its frame. She took her shawl from the peg and draped it over her shoulders. For a brief moment, she looked at the raven perched outside the window, its black eyes glinting like pieces of night. "Go," she whispered. "You don't belong in this part of the story." The door gave way with a final crash, splinters flying inward. Smoke and cold air rushed in together. Faces glowed in the torchlight, faces she knew. The farmer she once helped when his wife was sick. The woman who had once left bread by her stream. The same priest who had refused to meet her eyes last Sunday. They all stood before her now, their expressions twisted by fear and self-righteous fury. Someone threw a stone. It struck the wall beside her and rolled to her feet. "Speak your curse," which, a man shouted. "Confess before the Lord." She said nothing. Her silence unnerved them more than any spell could have. In that stillness, they began to move faster, fumbling to justify their rage. A torch was hurled through the open window, and fire caught on the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The flames climbed quickly, turning green and blue as they fed on the oils and powders. The light flickered across her face, and in that glow, she looked neither frightened nor angry, only profoundly sad. "Leave her," someone muttered. "It's done." But another voice, sharper, younger, replied, "Not until she's gone. Not until we've seen it." And so they stood there, watching her home burn, watching years of knowledge vanish into smoke. Through the rising heat, a small cry broke out from behind the crowd. A child's voice, thin, desperate. "Stop. Please stop." It was the little girl, the one who had once received her carved wooden bird. She pushed through the legs of the men, her eyes wide with terror. "She helped my mother. She's not evil." Her words rang out, fragile against the roar of the flames. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. The men looked at one another. Some lowered their torches, their anger cooling into confusion. The priest stepped forward, his robe singed at the hem. "Child," he said softly, "you do not understand. Evil wears the face of kindness. You must not be deceived." But the girl shook her head fiercely, tears streaking her cheeks. "You're the ones who don't understand. She saved us." A man pulled her back before she could finish. Her words fell away, swallowed by the crackling fire. The woman stood silent through it all. Smoke curled around her like a shroud, but her eyes remained clear. She reached for a small jar on her table, one that had miraculously survived the flames, and handed it to the child as she was dragged away. "For the fever," she said quietly, her voice soft but unwavering. "You'll know when to use it." The child clutched it to her chest as the crowd pulled her back toward safety. The fire roared higher. Sparks flew upward into the night, carried by the wind toward the trees. Someone shouted to move away, that the flames might spread, and the crowd began to scatter, leaving her there, framed in orange light. For a moment, she seemed part of the fire itself, unburning, untouchable, an image carved from defiance and sorrow. Then, through the smoke, two men rushed forward. They seized her by the arms and dragged her out of the house. She did not resist. Her feet brushed over the damp grass as they pulled her toward the open square near the stream. There, They tied her hands and left her beneath the watch of the priest and a handful of villagers. Behind them, her cottage collapsed, the roof falling inward with a hiss of steam and ash. The flames reflected in her eyes as she looked up at the dark sky. "You think you've ended something," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "But you've only begun it." The priest stiffened. "Blasphemy," he hissed. "No," she murmured. "Prophecy." The men didn't understand her words, but they unsettled them. She could see it, the doubt flickering behind their stern faces. Fear was a fragile thing. It needed to be fed constantly to survive. Now, as the fire dimmed and the heat gave way to the cold of night, she felt that fear begin to waver. The child's cry still echoed somewhere in the distance. The villagers who had once shouted now stood in uneasy silence, their torches dying one by one. A few turned away, unwilling to meet her gaze. The priest muttered a prayer under his breath, as if afraid that even his own faith might falter. The woman closed her eyes. Smoke drifted over her like a blanket, and she breathed it in deeply. She thought of her mother, of the forest in spring, of the gentle weight of rain on leaves. When she spoke again, it was to no one and to everyone. "Light consumes itself," she said. "And when it does, the dark begins to heal." The wind shifted. The last of the flames collapsed into embers, scattering across the ground like dying stars. By morning, the cottage would be nothing but blackened earth. But something else would take root there, something they would never understand until it was too late. That night, the valley burned with more than fire. It burned with guilt, with memory, with the first faint spark of redemption waiting, hidden beneath the ashes. By dawn, the valley was quiet again. The fires had burned themselves into silence, leaving only the black skeletons of what once was her home, her garden, her life's work. The villagers moved through the smoke like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Some spoke in hushed tones, saying the witch was gone, that evil had been purged. Others said nothing at all, afraid that words might awaken something still lingering in the air. The priest stood at the edge of the field, his robes darkened by ash. His hands shook slightly as he clutched his rosary. He had led them in the name of righteousness, yet as he watched the smoldering ruin, a doubt crept into him, a whisper he could not silence. The night's frenzy had faded, and now, in the cold clarity of morning, everything felt wrong. The girl's cries still rang in his mind. Her small, trembling voice had sounded more true than all his sermons combined. He turned away from the ashes, crossing himself quickly as if to ward off his own guilt. Behind him, a few villagers lingered, looking for something, proof that she had died, perhaps, or reassurance that she hadn't. But there was nothing. No body. No bones. Only a circle of scorched grass where she had last stood. Someone murmured that maybe the wind had taken her. Another whispered that she had vanished before the flames touched her. By noon, those whispers had already become stories, and by nightfall, they would become legends. Children were told to stay away from the stream after sunset. It was said her spirit walked there, her reflection appearing in the water when the moon was full. Farmers claimed that their crops grew strangely green near the ashes, thriving when everything else withered. The priest tried to banish these stories, calling them lies born of fear, but even he avoided the valley at dusk. The air there felt wrong, too still, too watchful. Weeks passed. The villagers rebuilt their routines, though never their peace. Strange things began to happen. The old miller's wife woke one morning to find the word mercy traced in frost across her window. A child claimed she saw the woman standing among the trees, her shawl unburned, her face calm. Cattle that had fallen ill recovered overnight. Herbs once useless began to heal again. Slowly, the people began to wonder whether what they had destroyed had been their salvation all along. The little girl, the one who had cried for her, kept the jar close, hidden beneath her bed. Her mother often caught her whispering to it, as if speaking to someone inside. One evening, when her mother's fever returned, the girl unscrewed the lid. The scent that rose was unlike anything human, sweet, earthy, ancient. She touched a drop to her mother's lips. By morning, the fever had broken. The girl smiled through tears, clutching the jar as sunlight poured through the window. From that day forward, she tended the ground where the woman's house once stood. She cleared the ashes, planted seeds, and watered them every night. The soil was dark and rich, almost too alive. Within weeks, small white flowers began to bloom, flowers no one had ever seen before. They glowed faintly under moonlight, their petals trembling as if breathing. When villagers saw them, they stayed away. Some said they were cursed, others that they were blessed. But the girl knew. She felt no fear standing there. Only peace. Years passed. The valley aged, but the flowers never died. The girl grew into a young woman, quiet and thoughtful, with eyes that seemed to see through lies. People came to her when sickness struck, when their animals ailed, when their hearts grew heavy. She would listen, sometimes touch their hands, and always, something changed. She never took payment. She said only, "Kindness returns." It didn't take long before the whispers began again. Some called her healer. Others called her witch. The priest, now old and frail, heard these whispers and felt his heart twist with dread and regret. He had thought himself a man of faith, but now, every time he passed the valley, he saw the flowers gleaming and heard her last words echoing in his mind. "You think you've ended something, but you've only begun it." At night, he prayed for forgiveness, not from God, but from her. He would see her in his dreams, not as a vengeful spirit, but as a calm figure surrounded by wind and light. Sometimes she said nothing. Sometimes she smiled. That smile haunted him more than any curse could. One winter morning, when frost lay thick across the fields, the villagers found the priest's door open and his chair empty. The fire had long gone cold, but on the table, there lay a single sprig of white petals, fresh, alive, glimmering faintly against the gray dawn. Some said it was left by the healer. Others said the wind brought it. But the old ones, those who remembered the night of fire, said nothing. They just looked toward the valley, where a thin line of mist curled upward like smoke. The young woman stood there at the edge of the stream, her hands clasped before her. She could feel something vast moving around her, not wind, not sound, but memory. The air shimmered faintly, and for a moment, she thought she saw another figure beside her, older, gentler, wrapped in the same shawl that had once burned. The spirit didn't speak. It only touched her shoulder lightly before fading into the morning light. The young woman smiled, her breath visible in the cold. The valley would never forget. Its soil carried stories deeper than roots. The people who once feared her name now spoke it softly, half in prayer, half in longing. They built no monument, no cross, no shrine, only left the field untouched, letting the white flowers spread until they carpeted the ground like snow. On quiet nights, when the moon was full, their glow could be seen from miles away, a gentle reminder that even in destruction, something sacred can take root again. And so the story lived on, whispered from mother to child, generation after generation, not as a tale of punishment, but of awakening. They no longer spoke of witches with fear, but with reverence. The woman who once stood against the fire became a symbol of what humanity destroys when blinded by fear, and what nature, in its quiet mercy, always finds a way to heal. The years rolled on, and the valley grew older, quieter, wiser. The old houses leaned with time, their beams softened by moss and rain, yet the field of white flowers remained untouched, vivid, glowing, eternal. They had become part of the land's rhythm, blooming each spring with an almost ethereal grace. Travelers passing through would pause and stare, drawn by something they couldn't name. The villagers no longer warned them away. They simply said, "That's where she sleeps." No one remembered her name anymore, only her story. And as stories do, it had changed over time. Some said she had made a pact with the earth to protect the valley. Others claimed she had turned into the mist that guarded their crops from frost. In some versions, she was a spirit of mercy, in others, a restless ghost. But beneath every retelling was an unspoken truth: the land had loved her back. Even after death, it had kept her safe. The healer's legacy lived on quietly through the young woman who had once tended her ashes. She grew into a figure of calm strength, respected and yet still watched with the cautious or reserved for those who dwell between worlds. She never denied what people called her, nor did she embrace it. When villagers asked how she knew what she knew, how to soothe a fever with a whisper, how to find water when drought came, she only smiled and said, "The earth tells me." And perhaps it did. On still nights, she could hear the rustle of leaves in a language she almost understood. When the wind swept through the valley, she sometimes caught a faint scent of smoke and sage, a reminder of what had been lost and what had endured. She kept no books, no charms, no potions, only knowledge passed from soil to hand, from breath to breath. She lived humbly, but within her simplicity was a kind of quiet magnificence that no one could explain. As the seasons turned, a new generation grew up knowing her not as a witch, but as the valley's guardian. Parents brought their children to her when nightmares came, when fevers spiked, when grief lingered too long. She spoke softly to them, her voice slow and even, like rain pattering on leaves. The children would fall asleep while she hummed, and when they awoke, their pain had lessened. The mothers would thank her, sometimes with tears, and she would nod, never asking for more than a handful of wild herbs in return. But peace is never eternal. One spring, strangers came to the valley, merchants and preachers from distant towns, drawn by rumors of the miracle healer. They carried silver crosses, fine robes, and eyes sharpened by judgment. The new priest who led them was young, confident, and unyielding. He had grown up hearing stories of witches and saviors, of faith tested by temptation. To him, miracles belonged only to God, and any other source of healing was blasphemy. He stood before the villagers in the square, his voice ringing with certainty. "You have fallen into old sins," he said. "You have traded holy prayer for pagan whispers. You kneel to a woman, not to the Lord." The villagers listened, uncertain, afraid to contradict a man of the cloth. For years they had known peace, and now the familiar scent of suspicion returned like smoke creeping beneath a closed door. The healer said nothing at first. She continued her work as always, tending the sick, blessing the fields, guiding the lost. But as the days passed, she began to notice the change. People averted their eyes again. Doors closed more quickly when she passed. Children were pulled away by nervous hands. She recognized the signs. The old fear was awakening. One evening, as she walked to the river, she found a small cross nailed to her door. Below it, a message written in chalk: "Confess or burn." Her heart did not race. She simply stared for a long time, then brushed the chalk away with her sleeve. "It always returns," she whispered, half to herself, half to the wind. The next morning, she went to the church. The priest met her at the threshold, his expression firm but cautious. "You claim to heal," he said. "Tell me where your power comes from." "From the same place your prayers do," she replied. "From mercy." He frowned. "You use herbs. You use words not found in Scripture. You call to things unseen." "I listen," she said softly. "That's all." He turned away, unsettled by her calmness. "Listening to the wrong voice can damn a soul," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "And ignoring the right one can damn a village." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something human passed between them, a flicker of doubt, of recognition. But pride is louder than truth, and the young priest turned away. "Leave this place," he said, "or I will see it purified." She left the church without another word. That night, she sat by the stream, the moonlight rippling over her face. The water glowed faintly where it touched the white flowers, and she felt the hum of the land beneath her palms. The same hum her predecessor must have felt generations ago, the pulse of something vast, forgiving, alive. "It's always the same," she murmured. "Fear, fire, forgetting. But still you endure." In the distance, bells rang, harsh, metallic, unyielding. The valley stirred. Dogs barked. The air thickened with the scent of coming rain. She stood, gathering a small pouch of herbs, and walked back toward the village. She knew what was coming. History was looping upon itself, drawing another circle of smoke and superstition. But she would not run. She never had. Inside her home, she lit a single candle and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for them. For the ones who would raise their hands against her, believing they were doing right. The flame flickered once, then steadied. She closed her eyes, her breath slow, even, unafraid. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping gently against the earth, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away what was about to happen. Far to the east, beyond the deserts and the mountains, another world was suffering in silence. The lands of Asia, vast and varied, were not spared from the shadow that had swallowed the sun. From the great cities of China to the steppes of Mongolia, the dim sky stretched endlessly, turning the familiar rhythm of seasons into a cycle of confusion and loss. In the great empire of Northern Wei, already weakened by division and political decay, the darkness deepened its fall. The emperor's court, once brilliant with silk and ceremony, now sat beneath a sky of pale gray. Messengers brought grim news from the countryside: rivers that failed to flood, harvests that rotted before they ripened, and villages where entire families had vanished. Ancient Chinese chronicles, precise and meticulous, record that in the year 536, yellow dust rained like snow, and the sun lost its light. The people believed that heaven had withdrawn its favor. In a culture built upon the harmony between heaven and earth, such signs were more than omens, they were judgments. Farmers knelt in their barren fields and prayed to unseen gods. Scholars wrote desperate poems to the sky, wondering if humanity had broken the balance of nature. In Luoyang, once the beating heart of the empire, markets shrank to shadows of their former selves. Grain became so rare that the price of a handful could buy a horse. Beggars lined the city gates, their voices hoarse from hunger. The northern steppes fared even worse. The Turkic and Mongolic tribes who depended on their herds saw those herds perish one by one. Grasslands turned brown under the ash-gray skies, and what little vegetation grew was coarse and sparse. Horses, the lifeblood of their nomadic culture, grew weak and died in droves. With each passing month, the steppe people found themselves forced to move south, pressing into China's borders. Refugees and raiders alike spilled across the frontiers, desperate for food. The Chinese generals, weakened by internal strife, could do little to hold them back. What began as a natural disaster began to unravel the political order of an entire continent. In the south, where the lands were warmer, famine still took hold, though its grip was slower. The rice paddies of the Yangtze Basin, the pride of southern China, suffered under erratic rains and sudden frost. The delicate rhythm of planting and harvest was broken, and with it, the stability of countless lives. Families who had farmed the same land for generations abandoned their homes and fled toward cities in hope of relief. But the cities had nothing to give. The local governors, already strained by taxation and unrest, could not feed the swelling crowds. Roads filled with the sick and starving. Disease followed famine, spreading in the wake of desperation. The empire trembled, not from invasion, but from the slow, unrelenting pressure of hunger. Further west, across the great mountain passes, the lands of Central Asia echoed the same despair. Caravan routes along the Silk Road, once alive with traders carrying silk, spices, and knowledge, fell silent. The sand dunes of the Taklamakan and the high plateaus of Tibet saw fewer travelers. The once thriving oasis towns that had connected east and west began to wither. Wells dried up, and the wind carried only dust. Merchants who dared to travel spoke of a dead sky and of nights so cold that camels froze standing. In the quiet that followed, the great arteries of trade that linked empires slowed almost to a stop. The lifeblood of civilization itself was draining away. Even further south, in the kingdoms of India, the dim sun brought confusion to a land accustomed to abundance. The monsoon rains faltered, arriving late or not at all. Rivers that had flowed steadily for millennia shrank to narrow streams. The Ganges Basin, a cradle of faith and civilization, faced drought and famine. Temples filled with prayers to Vishnu and Shiva, to gods of creation and preservation, but the heavens remained silent. Chronicles tell of wandering ascetics who saw in the darkened world a divine warning, a reminder of impermanence. Kings and peasants alike were humbled before forces beyond comprehension. In the highlands of Nepal, small mountain communities endured as best they could, living on stores of grain and the thin yield of cold-resistant crops. Yet even there, where survival had always been a test of endurance, The gray skies brought unease. The Himalayas loomed like watchful giants under a dim and foreign light. The people whispered of a curse from the gods, of spirits that had grown weary of humankind's greed. The stillness in the mountain air felt heavy, unnatural, as if time itself had slowed. Across Asia, stories began to form, myths and legends that tried to make sense of what reason could not explain. In China, poets spoke of a dragon that had swallowed the sun. In India, seers saw visions of a cosmic imbalance, a war among celestial beings that had dimmed the heavens. In the steppes, warriors told tales of the sky god turning his face away from humankind. These stories, born from suffering, would live long after the famine passed. They became part of the shared human attempt to understand disaster, to give shape to fear through words. And yet, beneath the despair, there was something else, something quietly defiant. In villages and temples, in yurts and mountain caves, people still lit fires. They shared what little they had. They told stories not only of loss, but of endurance. The chroniclers who recorded those years did not just capture pain, they captured survival. In the faint light of their candles, they wrote of neighbors who helped each other, of strangers who shared their last handful of grain, of faith that did not break even when the sun did. Slowly, imperceptibly, the world began to change. Populations shifted. Kingdoms collapsed and others arose in their place. New paths were forged, both physical and cultural. The Silk Road, once broken by famine, would one day reawaken stronger than before. In the ashes of despair, a new chapter of human movement began, one that would spread not only goods, but ideas, languages, and beliefs. By the end of the decade, the skies began to clear over Asia. The faint warmth of the sun returned, but the memory of the darkness remained. The world that emerged from those gray years was not the same one that had entered them. People had seen the fragility of all things, empires, crops, and even faith. Yet they had also discovered something enduring, that even under the dimmest light, humanity continues to move forward. The lands of Asia, like the rest of the world, had been tested by silence. And from that silence, new stories were born. The valley settled into a quiet rhythm after that night, but it was a different kind of peace, one that carried memory and reverence rather than ignorance and fear. The villagers went about their lives with a cautious respect for the land and the stories that had taken root there. They spoke less of witches and curses and more of mercy, healing, and the strange ways the world seemed to correct itself when humans acted in fear. Children were warned not to trample the white flowers, not because of superstition, but because someone, long ago, had shown them the cost of blind judgment. The young woman who had inherited the healer's legacy walked the valley daily, barefoot on damp earth, her eyes scanning the soil for signs of life or distress. Each step felt like a conversation with the land, each breath a silent acknowledgement of what had been lost and what had endured. She had learned patience, not from books or teachers, but from the pulse of nature itself. When the wind shifted or the river swelled, she understood its meaning, as if it spoke in a language older than human words. Her hands, gentle but precise, tended the flowers, nurtured new seedlings, and guided water to struggling crops. To outsiders, it seemed miraculous, but to her, it was simply listening. The villagers, slowly, began to trust her guidance. When a child fell sick, she would be called first. When livestock faltered, her presence was requested before prayer alone. Her remedies were simple: herbs, clean water, small rituals rooted in observation and compassion, but they worked. Fever broke, wounds healed, crops flourished, and the river never ran dry. People began to whisper that the valley itself had taken her into its care, that the land would answer only through her hands. The young woman did not correct them. She knew the truth. It was not magic, not curses, not divine punishment. It was the balance of listening, patience, and courage. Winter came, harsh and unyielding, but even under frost and snow, the valley retained its quiet glow. The white flowers persisted beneath the ice, their stems resilient, their roots deep. The villagers marveled at them, speaking softly in awe. She must have blessed the soil, some would say. Others only nodded, sensing that words were inadequate. The old priest, now frail and subdued, would occasionally wander into the valley, hands trembling, eyes misted. He came not to judge, but to witness, to see the living proof of mercy and courage enduring beyond human fear. One night, a traveler arrived from a distant town, lost and weary. He carried a chest filled with silver coins and whispered rumors of sorcery. When he found the young woman, he demanded payment, claiming he had been promised riches for his guidance. She looked at him calmly, her eyes reflecting the moonlight on the river. "I do not ask for payment," she said softly, "only that you respect what you do not understand." The traveler laughed, impatient and scornful. "So you are a witch," he said. "Perhaps," she replied, "but I heal, not harm. The land is my witness." Skepticism turned to awe as he spent the night in the valley. The river, swollen from recent rains, threatened to flood the fields, yet under her careful guidance, the water was redirected, saving crops and homes alike. He left the next morning humbled, leaving behind the coins and carrying with him a story he would tell for the rest of his life, not of fear, but of reverence. Seasons cycled into years. The villagers' respect deepened into devotion of a quiet kind. Festivals were held not in the church, but in the valley itself, celebrating harvests, rain, and health. They left small offerings near the white flowers, a sprig of rosemary, a handmade charm, a whispered word of thanks. It was not worship in the old sense, not prayer to a deity, but acknowledgement of a force greater than themselves, the force of listening, courage, and mercy. The young woman never claimed power over them. She acted as a bridge, a steward, a witness. And through it all, she never forgot the woman who had come before her. The healer who had faced fire, accusation, and the weight of human fear had left more than remedies and herbs. She had left a legacy of endurance, of compassion intertwined with courage, of a life lived in alignment with the pulse of the earth. When the young woman rested by the river at night, she often closed her eyes and felt a presence, faint and comforting, like a hand brushing her shoulder or a whisper in the wind. It was not ghostly, not fearful. It was guidance, memory, and love. As years passed, the valley thrived. Crops were abundant, sickness rare, and even the most stubborn winters failed to break the rhythm of life there. Visitors often commented on the peculiar serenity of the place, the sense that it existed out of time, touched by something unnameable yet profoundly real. Those born in the valley understood this instinctively. They walked with care, spoke softly, and treated each living thing as sacred. The lessons of fire and fear had endured, shaping generations. And so, the story continued quietly, carried in whispers, in glances, in small acts of kindness. The valley, once a place of suspicion and anger, had become a haven. The white flowers bloomed eternally, silent witnesses to courage and mercy, and the young woman moved among them, calm, patient, and resolute. Through listening, understanding, and compassion, she preserved the legacy of the one who had saved them all, ensuring that the fear which once consumed the valley would never rise again. Every night, as the moon reflected on the river and the wind rustled through the trees, the valley exhaled a slow, steady breath, as if remembering. And somewhere in that memory, the woman who had faced fire smiled. Her work was done, but her presence endured, in the soil, in the flowers, in the hearts of those who finally understood. The valley was healed, not by vengeance, not by power, but by enduring love and courage that refused to be forgotten. In the vast stretches of Europe, far beyond the Mediterranean, the darkness continued its quiet conquest. The great forests of the continent, usually alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, fell strangely silent. Animals wandered in confusion, their patterns disrupted by the unfamiliar cold and dim light. Deer came closer to villages in search of food, wolves prowled with bolder hunger, and livestock weakened despite the care of their keepers. Human populations, once confident in their dominion over the land, now felt the vulnerability of their fragile existence. The rhythm of life, planting, growing, harvesting, had been broken, leaving communities scrambling to survive each day without certainty. In Gaul, the fields that had once fed legions and cities now lay fallow. Farmers looked on helplessly as their wheat failed to ripen, their barley rotted in the fields, and their roots shriveled beneath a soil hardened by frost and ash. Villagers rationed what little remained, often giving priority to children and the elderly, yet even these careful measures were insufficient. Hunger whispered through every home, growing into a persistent ache. Markets, once bustling centers of commerce, became ghostly corridors. The merchants' voices that had once echoed across town squares were replaced by quiet desperation, and food, once plentiful, became the rarest of commodities. Beyond the fields, in cities such as Paris and Lyon, the crisis deepened. Grain shipments that had traditionally flowed from the countryside dwindled to nearly nothing. Bakers struggled to feed the population, and bread became precious, a symbol of survival itself. Those who could afford it hoarded supplies, while the poor scavenged in the forests and abandoned structures, hoping for scraps. Disease, hunger, and exposure claimed lives with quiet cruelty, often leaving no records beyond fleeting mentions in chronicles and letters. The urban population, reliant on external supply chains, felt the effects of famine more immediately, as the flow of sustenance stopped almost entirely. The northern kingdoms, too, were not spared. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes in what would later become England faced failed harvests and biting winters. Snow fell earlier than ever recorded, lingering into months that should have been warm. Crops froze in the fields, rivers and ponds froze, killing fish and other aquatic life. Villages became isolated, cut off from neighbors by snow and ice. Nomadic groups moved southward in search of food, sometimes encroaching on settled lands and creating conflict born not of ambition, but of desperation. Fear and caution became second nature, as even familiar landscapes felt hostile under the new climate. In the eastern reaches of Europe, Slavic tribes faced the same dire reality. Livestock perished en masse, and pastures withered to gray dust. Communities abandoned their settlements, migrating in search of fertile land or more hospitable climates. These migrations created pressure on bordering regions, sparking disputes and occasional skirmishes as people fought not for power, but simply to survive. The flow of populations reshaped borders and influenced cultural exchange in ways that would ripple across centuries, demonstrating that the catastrophe of 536 AD was as much social as it was environmental. The collapse of seasonal cycles disrupted not only agriculture, but also the spiritual and cultural rhythms of society. Festivals tied to planting and harvest were cancelled or muted, and rituals designed to honor the gods or bless the land seemed powerless under the persistent gray sky. Temples, once vibrant centers of community life, felt empty, their priests struggling to maintain faith in the face of visible evidence of nature's cruelty. Songs of joy and praise became rare, replaced by hymns of desperation and lamentation. The psychological toll was immense, and even those accustomed to hardship felt the weight of despair pressing heavily upon them. Amid this chaos, the great cities of the Frankish kingdoms, centers of political power and culture, faced the strain of famine. Noble estates, which had previously supported thousands through organized agriculture, could no longer guarantee sustenance. Serfs and laborers, desperate for food, sometimes fled to the forests or neighboring lands. Towns along rivers like the Loire and the Seine, dependent on both local harvests and riverine trade, found themselves increasingly isolated. The breakdown of these systems revealed the fragile interconnectedness of medieval society and how quickly civilization could unravel when the earth itself turned against its inhabitants. Even the cultural achievements of the period could not shield communities from the cold and hunger. Manuscripts detailing philosophy, law, and literature were preserved only in the hope that human ingenuity might survive beyond famine. Artisans who once created fine wares found their hands idle, their workshops closed due to the scarcity of materials. Education slowed. Scholarly pursuits were put aside for the immediate demands of survival. Yet even in the face of adversity, humans continued to adapt. They learned to store food more carefully, cultivate less favorable soils, and share resources among extended families and neighbors. Survival became a communal endeavor, knitting together families, villages, and towns in new and often unexpected ways. By the fifth year of hardship, Europe had been irrevocably changed. Landscapes bore the marks of famine and frost, cities bore the weight of scarcity and fear, and the collective memory of people carried the indelible shadow of the dimmed sun. The old rhythms of life, of planting and harvesting, of feasts and festivals, had been fractured. But the human spirit, though tested and worn, endured. Communities adapted, migrated, and survived, laying the foundation for the Europe that would emerge in the centuries to follow. The crisis of 536 AD had stripped the continent bare, yet from that barrenness came resilience, innovation, and a new awareness of the precariousness of life under the ever-changing sky. In the lands of the Middle East, the dimmed sun cast an unusual pall over valleys that had once been renowned for fertility and abundance. The great crescent of civilization, stretching from Mesopotamia through Persia to the Levant, experienced famine and disruption on a scale that shook the foundations of kingdoms. Rivers that had fed civilizations for millennia, like the Tigris, Euphrates, and Jordan, swelled or shrank unpredictably, leaving farmers uncertain whether to plant or wait. Crops rotted in the fields under the weight of frost and ash, while wells ran low, forcing villagers to dig deeper into parched earth for what little water remained. Hunger became the silent ruler of these lands, shaping the lives of everyone, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant. Cities that had long been centers of trade and learning faced isolation. Caravan routes along the deserts became perilous as sandstorms rose with unusual frequency, erasing trails and burying provisions. Traders reported seeing mirages that confused even the most seasoned travelers, and many journeys ended in abandonment or death. Markets that had once thrived under the exchange of spices, textiles, and metals became ghostly spaces. Merchants, once confident in the abundance of their goods, were forced to ration what little they had, and even the wealthiest could not escape the quiet dominion of scarcity. In the heart of Persia, the Sasanian Empire faced similar trials. The fields along the Tigris and Euphrates, which had once produced grain to feed armies and cities, yielded only partial harvests. Pastures turned brittle, and livestock perished. Nomadic tribes pushed southward, driven by hunger, occasionally clashing with settled populations. The government struggled to maintain order, sending soldiers not to wage war, but to protect food stores. The prestige of the court and the authority of kings were weakened not by conquest, but by the unrelenting forces of nature. Religious leaders interpreted the calamity as divine judgment, urging repentance, yet the haze and cold persisted, defying understanding or appeasement. Further west, in the Levant and Egypt, famine brought social unrest and the breakdown of community structures. The Nile, whose annual floods had been relied upon for centuries, behaved erratically, either overflowing with destructive force or shrinking into shallow, parched channels. Grain shipments to the cities faltered. In Alexandria, once a hub of learning and trade, bread became scarce and riots broke out. Citizens, desperate to survive, turned on one another. The wealthiest attempted to secure supplies for their households, but social tension surged as the imbalance between haves and have-nots became impossible to ignore. The psychological and cultural impact was profound. In towns and villages, people turned to religious and cultural traditions for explanations. Temples and shrines were filled day and night with prayers and offerings. Priests and scholars wrote of omens, strange skies, and cosmic disturbances. Astrology and divination saw renewed importance, as communities sought patterns in the chaos. People wondered if they were witnessing the end of an age, a punishment for past transgressions, or simply the unpredictable wrath of nature itself. The world seemed to shrink under the veil of gray, and even the most learned observers were humbled by forces beyond their comprehension. In rural communities, daily life became a battle against slow starvation. Families rationed grain, boiled roots, and sometimes ate animals that would normally have been livestock for trade or labor. Children grew weaker, and parents faced agonizing choices about whom to feed first. Entire villages reported losses of significant portions of their populations. The climate, while silent, exerted a constant pressure that tested human endurance to the limits. Social bonds were strained, but survival also inspired ingenuity. New techniques of food storage, small-scale irrigation, and barter systems emerged to help communities weather the famine. Even in the courts of kings and emperors, the effects of 536 AD were felt. Officials attempted to maintain authority through distribution of supplies, yet the scale of the crisis often overwhelmed them. Military campaigns were delayed or abandoned, as soldiers could not be sustained without adequate food. Diplomatic relations between kingdoms were strained, with food scarcity intensifying competition for resources. Empires and principalities alike were forced to adapt to a new reality in which human power was dwarfed by the sheer scale of environmental disruption. By the end of the decade, the Middle East had been irrevocably altered. Agricultural patterns shifted, trade networks were disrupted, and populations migrated in search of sustenance. Yet amid the hardship, resilience endured. Communities adapted, governments recalibrated, and cultures evolved in response to these challenges. The famine and dimmed sun of 536 AD had revealed the vulnerability of human society to forces beyond control, but they had also illuminated the capacity for endurance and adaptation, a reminder that even under shadowed skies, life persisted, finding ways to endure and rebuild. Across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean and into the heart of Europe, the years of famine and dimmed sunlight continued to reshape societies in ways both subtle and profound. In Italy, Spain, and the southern regions of Gaul, the social fabric was stretched thin as families struggled to survive. Farmers, once confident in the rhythm of planting and harvest, faced unpredictable seasons that yielded little sustenance. Fields lay barren or destroyed, livestock weakened, and granaries emptied far faster than they could be replenished. Villages relied upon their neighbors for survival, often sharing the last remnants of grain and salted meat, and creating networks of mutual aid that would later form the basis of regional solidarity. Yet even these efforts could not stave off hunger entirely, and mortality quietly rose, leaving some hamlets reduced to mere shadows of their former populations. In the urban centers, the crisis was amplified. Cities like Rome, Carthage, Marseille, and Toledo were dependent on the steady flow of grain from the countryside, yet those shipments had dwindled to near nothing. Markets that had once overflowed with produce, fish, and bread now stood eerily quiet. Families rationed meager supplies with painstaking care, while the wealthy, though still possessing wealth, could not escape the universal hunger. Social tensions grew, and occasional riots erupted as desperation overcame patience. The desperation was not only physical but psychological. The sun remained dim, the days colder than usual, and the uncertainty of survival weighed heavily on the minds of citizens. Northern Europe, where agriculture had always been more marginal, fared even worse. In the lands of the Franks, Saxons, and other Germanic tribes, the famine compounded existing hardships. Forests provided some sustenance in the form of wild game and foraged roots, but the diminished light and unseasonable cold limited growth, and hunting could not fully replace cultivated crops. Communities migrated in search of food, sometimes encountering other groups and creating conflict or alliances in equal measure. These movements altered settlement patterns and would shape the political geography of Europe for generations. The hunger of 536 to 540 AD forced human populations to become more mobile, flexible, and adaptive even under extreme stress. In the British Isles, chroniclers spoke of years without sun and failure of bread, describing a world where the basic cycles of life were thrown into chaos. Crops failed repeatedly, rivers froze, and livestock died in disproportionate numbers. Communities that had once been self-sufficient were pressed to their limits, and even coastal settlements found fishing unreliable due to changing conditions at sea. The social and economic structures of early medieval Britain were tested, leading to local innovations in food storage, communal labor, and resource sharing. Survival became an all-consuming concern, reshaping priorities and customs in ways that would echo into future generations. The psychological effects of prolonged famine extended beyond mere survival. Fear and superstition grew alongside hunger, shaping cultural and religious life. In towns and villages, people interpreted the gray skies and failing crops as signs of divine displeasure. Monks and priests prayed fervently, seeking to restore favor with the gods, while scholars and scribes recorded events with meticulous attention, creating chronicles that would preserve the memory of the crisis for centuries. The collective memory of these events shaped mythology, folklore, and even later religious practices, as humanity attempted to make sense of forces it could not control. Migration and social disruption created unexpected consequences as well. Populations moving south and east in search of food brought new ideas, languages, and cultural practices into regions previously isolated. Formerly stable kingdoms had to contend with influxes of refugees, which strained resources but also contributed to the diffusion of knowledge and customs. These movements laid the groundwork for future political and cultural transformations, demonstrating that catastrophe, while destructive, could also serve as a catalyst for change. Even in the Mediterranean, where climates were typically more forgiving, cities experienced unrest. Bread riots in Alexandria, Carthage, and Antioch were fueled not only by scarcity but by fear and uncertainty. Officials tried to maintain order by distributing grain or offering temporary relief, yet the magnitude of the crisis exceeded administrative capacity. Social hierarchies were challenged, and the distinction between rich and poor became less meaningful in the face of universal hunger. The psychological strain on leaders, merchants, and commoners alike underscored the fragility of human systems when confronted with prolonged environmental stress. By the end of the 5th year, Europe and the Mediterranean had been irrevocably altered. Communities had learned to adapt or perish, migration had reshaped the human landscape, and cultural memory had been indelibly marked by famine and fear. Yet despite the immense suffering, resilience endured. People innovated, shared, and persevered, maintaining the threads of civilization in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of 536 AD was one of both loss and endurance, a stark reminder that humanity, though vulnerable to the forces of nature, possesses an extraordinary capacity to survive, adapt, and rebuild, even under the dimmest skies. The valley had settled into a long, enduring rhythm, its life measured by the subtle pulse of nature and the quiet dedication of the guardian who walked among its hills and streams. Time had softened old memories of fear, leaving only the lessons that had been carved into the hearts of the villagers and their descendants. The white flowers, now abundant across the valley, glimmered in every season, a living testament to courage, compassion, and the enduring power of mercy. Travelers would pause among them, sensing a quiet presence in the air, a gentle reminder that this place had been shaped by love and bravery, not by force or superstition. The guardian, her hair now fully silver, moved with a slow, deliberate grace, each step mindful and precise. She tended the crops, guided the rivers, and healed both people and animals with hands steady and sure. Her voice, soft yet commanding in its calm authority, carried lessons without the need for words: patience, observation, and the quiet courage to act with integrity. Visitors often felt a sense of awe in her presence, sensing that she was not merely a person, but a living bridge between the valley and the enduring wisdom of the earth itself. She never claimed power, for she understood that true strength lay in service, not dominance. The villagers, shaped by generations of observing the valley's rhythms, lived in harmony with the land. Children grew up learning to respect every living thing, moving gently among the flowers and listening to the faint whispers of the wind and river. Adults coordinated planting, harvesting, and tending livestock with attentiveness, guided by both tradition and observation. They had learned, through experience and story, that fear led only to destruction, while attentiveness and compassion nurtured life. The valley was a living classroom, and every person who dwelt there was both student and participant in the ongoing story of endurance and mercy. Even in times of hardship, the valley endured. Harsh winters covered the fields with snow, and occasional storms threatened to wash away crops, yet the land remained resilient, responding to the guardian's careful guidance and the villagers' steady cooperation. Every challenge became a lesson, every obstacle a test of patience and courage. The river that once threatened flooding now flowed smoothly, guided by channels and care, sustaining life instead of destroying it. The white flowers, though delicate in appearance, withstood frost, drought, and wind, their persistence a constant reminder that resilience is born from endurance and attention, not force. Visitors continued to come, drawn by the stories of a valley where life flourished against expectation. scholars, travelers, and seekers of wisdom would arrive, observing the harmony and learning the lessons embedded in every interaction with the land. They watched as the guardian moved through the fields, tending plants, healing creatures, and quietly guiding the villagers. Her actions were deliberate, unhurried, and full of intention, teaching the subtle arts of listening and responding to the world around them. Every gesture, every word, every careful movement conveyed knowledge that no book could capture, knowledge rooted in lived experience, empathy, and respect for life. The guardian often spent long hours near the river, letting the water flow past her hands, feeling the pulse of the valley beneath her palms. She sensed the presence of her predecessor, the healer who had faced fire and fear, guiding her still through whispers of wind and rustling leaves. It was a presence not of haunting, but of quiet mentorship, a reminder that the work of courage and mercy continues beyond a single life. In these moments, she felt the timeless connection between past and present, human and land, life and memory, and she understood that her role was both stewardship and continuation of a story far larger than herself. The valley's harmony extended even to the most subtle aspects of life. Birds nested safely, rivers nourished crops, and the soil yielded abundance without struggle. The villagers had learned to respond with respect rather than fear, understanding the rhythms of growth, decay, and renewal. Festivals were simple but profound, celebrating harvests, rain, and health with offerings of flowers, herbs, and whispered words of gratitude. These rituals were not acts of magic, but acts of attentiveness, reinforcing the bond between humans and the valley's living systems. Each gesture, however small, was a lesson in humility and care. Over the decades, the guardian became a living embodiment of the valley's balance. Her presence was felt more than seen, her influence woven into every aspect of daily life. Travelers who arrived with skepticism often left humbled, carrying stories of a place where patience, observation, and compassion shaped reality. Even the descendants of the priest who once condemned the healer would hear whispers of the valley's enduring grace, tales that softened hearts and taught humility. The valley itself seemed to teach through example. Life flourishes when fear is replaced with understanding, and courage persists when guided by mercy. And always, the white flowers endured. They bloomed with the same fragile brilliance, each petal a testament to endurance, patience, and quiet power. They marked the passage of time, reminding every observer of the legacy carried through generations, the legacy of a woman who had faced fire and hatred, and of the guardian who continued her work. They were a living, breathing record of courage and compassion, a symbol of how love and attentiveness can shape a community, heal wounds, and preserve life across centuries. As twilight fell over the valley, the guardian would sit among the flowers, listening to the gentle murmur of the river and the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. She felt the pulse of the land beneath her, a slow, steady rhythm that connected past, present, and future. In that space, the lessons of courage, mercy, and patience were palpable, carried in every breath of wind, every glimmering petal, and every heartbeat of those who dwelt there. The valley had become more than a place. It had become a living testament to the enduring power of understanding, love, and quiet, unyielding courage. The valley had reached a rare and enduring harmony, shaped over decades by the lives of those who had come before and the quiet vigilance of the guardian who now walked among its hills and streams. The white flowers stretched across fields, meadows, and riverbanks, their petals glowing softly in sunlight and moonlight alike, a testament to resilience, courage, and mercy that transcended generations. Villagers moved through the landscape with respect and attentiveness, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of the earth. Children grew up understanding that every living thing mattered, that careful observation and quiet action could sustain life, and that courage often took the form of patience and mercy rather than force. The guardian, her hair fully silvered and her movements slower yet deliberate, walked among the fields as though in conversation with the land itself. She guided rivers, tended crops, healed both humans and animals, and nurtured the white flowers with hands both gentle and precise. Every gesture carried purpose, every step a lesson in attentiveness, every breath a silent acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of life. Travelers who arrived were often struck by the palpable calm, sensing that the valley existed in a state of balance beyond ordinary human understanding. Her presence was felt more than seen, a living bridge connecting generations, life, and memory, and those who encountered her carried away a sense of awe, reverence, and understanding. The villagers had internalized the lessons of the valley. Fear no longer dictated their actions. Instead, careful observation, patience, and compassion guided their lives. Children learned to walk softly among the flowers, adults coordinated planting and harvesting with attentiveness, and the entire community participated in maintaining the delicate balance that sustained their home. The valley had become a teacher, demonstrating that life thrives when care and understanding replace fear and judgment. Every storm navigated, every crop tended, every animal cared for reinforced the enduring lessons of courage and mercy, ensuring that the knowledge passed down from the healer to the guardian endured for generations. Seasons came and went, each one shaping the valley in subtle ways. Winter brought frost and snow, yet the white flowers persisted beneath the ice, resilient and enduring. Spring renewed life in astonishing abundance, summer rain nourished the crops and the soil, and autumn harvests were plentiful, testaments to both the fertility of the land and the attentive care of those who lived there. Challenges were met with thoughtful action rather than panic, and even the harshest storms could not disrupt the valley's rhythm. Nature, human effort, and the legacy of courage and mercy combined to create a rare balance, a living harmony that sustained life in its fullest sense. Visitors continued to arrive, drawn by tales of the valley's enduring prosperity and serenity. Scholars, travelers, and seekers of wisdom observed the guardian at work, guiding rivers, tending crops, and healing the sick. Her teachings were never direct instructions but demonstrations, the careful tending of soil, the gentle guidance of animals, the patient observation of the natural world. Those who came skeptical often left transformed, carrying stories not of magic, but of the profound and lasting impact of attentiveness, courage, and mercy. Each visitor departed with a sense that life flourishes when fear is replaced by understanding, and that the smallest acts of care can have enduring consequences. The white flowers remained central to the valley's identity, a living archive of endurance and resilience. Villagers would pause among them to reflect, children learning the importance of attentiveness, and elders passing down stories of courage, mercy, and the consequences of fear. Travelers often left offerings of ribbons, small tokens, or whispered words of gratitude, gestures that reinforced the connection between humans and the land. These simple acts, repeated across generations, strengthened the cycle of care and understanding, embedding the lessons of the valley into both memory and practice. The guardian often spent long hours near the river, feeling its pulse and listening to the subtle murmur of water over stones. In these quiet moments, she sensed the presence of the healer who had come before, guiding her with whispers of wind and rustling leaves. It was a presence of mentorship, memory, and continuity, reminding her that courage and mercy endure beyond a single life. She understood that her work was both stewardship and continuation of a legacy that had shaped the lives of the villagers and the very character of the land itself. Through decades, the valley had transformed into a sanctuary, a place where life thrived. Fear had been replaced by understanding, and courage and mercy were the guiding principles. Every living thing, from the smallest insect to the largest tree, participated in this living harmony. Villagers, guided by observation, care, and attention, maintained the balance, ensuring that the valley remained fertile, resilient, and peaceful. Festivals and harvests were celebrated in the fields, where the white flowers glowed faintly in moonlight, and stories of courage and endurance were passed down to each generation, not as warnings, but as guiding principles for life. And as night fell, the valley exhaled a slow, steady breath. The river reflected silver light across the petals, the wind carried the scent of earth and flowers, and the guardian sat among them quietly, feeling the pulse of the valley beneath her hands. She understood the depth of what had been preserved, the lessons of courage, mercy, and patience, embedded not only in soil and flower, but in the hearts of every villager and traveler who had walked these fields. The valley was no longer just a place. It had become a living testament to the enduring power of love, attentiveness, and quiet courage. Generations yet unborn would grow up in its embrace, learning the same lessons of patience and mercy, listening to the whispers of the land, and walking gently among the white flowers. And somewhere in the quiet folds of the valley, the presence of the healer who had once faced fire lingered, a soft, enduring reminder that courage and compassion can reshape the world, and that the smallest acts of care can echo through time, saving not only a village, but the very spirit of a place and its people. Even as the famine and darkness of 536 AD reached its peak, the ripples of catastrophe extended into every corner of the known world, leaving no land untouched and no people unaffected. In the vast lands of the Indian subcontinent, where fertile plains had long fed empires and civilizations, the monsoon failed with a cruelty that astonished even the oldest farmers. Rivers that had sustained crops for centuries, like the Ganges and Yamuna, ran low or vanished in stretches, leaving rice paddies dry and cracked. Seeds planted with hope shriveled in the sunless haze, and harvested crops often rotted before they could be stored. Villagers relied on stored grain and foraged foods, but even these reserves were limited and quickly exhausted. Hunger became an invisible master, guiding every decision from what to plant, what to eat, and how to ration food among family members. Parents watched their children with anxious eyes, knowing that even small mistakes could lead to irreversible loss. In the kingdoms of northern India, famine fueled unrest and displacement. Families abandoned ancestral villages in search of water and food, creating waves of migration toward the south and east. Entire communities uprooted themselves, traveling long distances with few possessions, relying on rivers, paths, and knowledge of terrain to navigate unfamiliar lands. Conflicts sometimes erupted with established settlements, as the desperate competed for dwindling resources. Yet in other cases, compassion prevailed, and strangers offered shelter, food, or guidance. These migrations, while born of desperation, also contributed to the exchange of cultural practices, languages, and traditions, leaving a legacy that would endure for generations. The psychological weight of famine and dimmed sunlight permeated every level of society. In the palaces of kings, ministers and advisors grappled with the limits of power. Political authority, once maintained through armies and tribute, was now undermined by forces beyond human control. Soldiers, weakened by hunger, could not march, workers could not labor effectively, taxation yielded less than ever. Courts sought to maintain order by distributing relief, yet the scale of suffering was such that efforts were often insufficient. In rural areas, the struggle was no less severe. Villagers developed intricate methods of rationing, using everything from grains and pulses to leaves, roots, and the occasional small animal to survive. Communities organized mutual aid networks, sharing meager supplies and collectively tending fields to ensure that as many people as possible survived until the next harvest. Even the sacred and cultural life of the subcontinent reflected the pervasive anxiety of this era. Temples, shrines, and holy sites became centers for both spiritual solace and practical support. Religious leaders guided communities in offerings, rituals, and prayers, seeking to appease the gods and coax life-giving rains from the skies. Legends arose to explain the prolonged darkness and crop failures, stories that depicted the wrath or displeasure of divine forces, cosmic trials, and the consequences of human hubris. These stories were passed down orally and eventually in written form, becoming integral to cultural memory and providing frameworks for understanding and enduring hardship. Scholars, poets, and chroniclers meticulously recorded these events, ensuring that future generations would remember both the suffering and the resilience of those who endured it. In the southern kingdoms, including those in the Deccan and along the coasts, communities adapted to scarcity with ingenuity. Farmers experimented with planting resilient crops, rotating fields differently, and harvesting earlier to avoid spoilage. Fishing communities, particularly along the western and eastern coasts, struggled as unusual climatic conditions affected fish populations, yet they adjusted their techniques, venturing further into the sea or relying on smaller inshore catches. Trade, which had long sustained cities, slowed as caravans and ships faced unpredictable weather and insecurity along routes. Merchants who once traveled with certainty now navigated hazards, risking not only loss of goods but their own lives. Economic life was disrupted, yet survival inspired innovation, collaboration, and strategic thinking, laying groundwork for the subcontinent's ability to endure future challenges. The famine also had profound effects on population health and demography. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving communities vulnerable to disease. Epidemics spread more easily among populations already strained by lack of food. Mortality rose, leaving gaps in families, communities, and labor forces. Despite these challenges, humans adapted. Techniques for preserving food improved, diets diversified with foraged plants and less conventional protein sources, and knowledge of natural signs, such as soil conditions, water levels, and animal behavior, became crucial for survival. Elders and experienced farmers became invaluable repositories of knowledge, guiding younger generations through a landscape altered by climate and famine. Social structures, too, shifted under the pressures of environmental stress. Villages relied more heavily on collective labor, pooling resources and energy to tend to fields and distribute food equitably. Hierarchies were tested, with leadership increasingly determined by the ability to manage scarcity and maintain cohesion rather than inherited privilege. Community decisions, once guided by tradition alone, now required pragmatism, negotiation, and foresight. Rituals, festivals, and cultural practices adapted to the reality of famine, incorporating acts of shared labor, mutual aid, and religious devotion to strengthen bonds and provide a sense of purpose amid adversity. In the urban centers of India, where trade, administration, and culture intersected, the famine's impact was keenly felt. Cities depended on a steady influx of grain from rural areas, yet that supply faltered. Markets that had once thrived now struggled to maintain basic provisions, and the price of food skyrocketed, leaving the poor and vulnerable in a constant state of crisis. She was more than a person. She had become a living embodiment of harmony, a bridge between the human and the natural, between fear and understanding, destruction and mercy. Stories of the healer and the guardian intertwined, forming a continuum of courage, attentiveness, and quiet power. Visitors departed with a deep respect for the valley, having witnessed a community that flourished through care, observation, and understanding. The valley had become a sanctuary not just of land, but of lessons embedded in every breath of wind, ripple of water, and glimmering flower. As night fell over the valley, the white flowers glowed with soft luminescence, rivers reflected silver light, and the wind carried the gentle perfume of earth and blossom. The guardian would sit quietly among the petals, sensing the pulse of life that connected past, present, and future. She understood the depth of the legacy she had inherited, the lessons of courage, patience, and mercy embedded in soil, water, air, and human hearts alike. The valley was more than a home. It was a living testament to the enduring power of attentiveness, love, and quiet courage that shaped generations and preserved life in a world too often ruled by fear and haste. Generations yet unborn would grow up among the white flowers, learning to walk gently, observe attentively, and act with patience and mercy. The valley itself had become a teacher, imparting lessons of resilience, understanding, and courage to all who entered. The guardian, resting among the petals, could sense the continuity of life and purpose, a living chain of guidance, courage, and care stretching across time. Every ripple in the river, every glimmer of moonlight on the flowers, every rustle of leaves whispered the enduring truth that patience and compassion could reshape the world. And so, the valley remained, eternal in its quiet power. The white flowers shimmered under sun and moon, the rivers flowed with gentle rhythm, and the wind carried the scent of life and growth. The guardian, the villagers, and every living thing within it coexisted in a harmony built on understanding, attentiveness, and mercy. The legacy of the woman called a witch endured, not as a tale of fear, but as a story of courage, compassion, and quiet, transformative power. Every action, every choice, every moment of care reinforced the timeless truth that love, patience, and courage, sustained through generations, can save a village, a valley, and a life. The valley's story, whispered in the wind and sung in the river's flow, would endure for centuries. Travelers, villagers, and descendants would carry the lessons forward, and the white flowers, shimmering eternally, would remind all who pass through that fear is fleeting, but courage, attentiveness, and mercy endure. The guardian, seated among them in the soft moonlight, could rest in the knowledge that her life had been a continuation of this profound legacy. She had ensured that the valley thrived, that life flourished, and that the story of the woman who had once been called a witch would remain a living, breathing testament to the transformative power of compassion, courage, and quiet strength.